The Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire didn't stumble into brutality. It built brutality into its foundation as a deliberate, calculated instrument of statecraft, operating out of what is now northern Iraq and Syria from roughly 2500 BCE until their collapse in 609 BCE. The Assyrians were the dominant military force of the ancient world for centuries, and they maintained that dominance through a strategy that modern military theorists might call psychological operations, except the Assyrians would have called it Tuesday. Before their armies even reached a city's walls, messengers and refugees would arrive carrying detailed, specific accounts of what happened to the last city that refused to surrender. The impaled bodies lining the roads, the flayed skins draped over the gates, the pyramids of severed heads stacked in the sun outside the ruins. This wasn't rumor. It was deliberate advanced propaganda, and it worked because every single detail was true. What makes the Assyrians uniquely disturbing isn't just the scale of their violence, but the fact that they documented it themselves. Proudly, in permanent stone. The palace walls at Nineveh were covered in elaborate carved relief panels, depicting their military campaigns in meticulous detail. Soldiers driving stakes through prisoners, scribes counting severed heads, while bodies pile up in the background, captives being led away with hooks through their lips. These weren't cautionary images, they were decorations, the ancient equivalent of hanging your vacation photos. King Ashurbanipal, who reigned from 668 to 627 BCE, and whose library ironically preserves some of humanity's most important ancient literature, left inscriptions describing in his own words how he dealt with rebel leaders, flaying them alive and draping their skins over the walls of their own cities, impaling others on stakes around the perimeter as a warning visible from miles away. The British Museum holds these inscriptions today. The Assyrians also pioneered mass deportation as a weapon of cultural destruction, forcibly relocating entire conquered populations, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, stripping them of their land, language, and communal identity, and scattering them across the empire in groups too small and too mixed to organize resistance. The Israelites weren't the only people to experience this. Dozens of peoples across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Anatolia were erased from their homelands this way. When Sennacherib sacked Babylon in 689 BCE, a city considered so sacred that even most Assyrian kings had avoided destroying it, he didn't just burn it, he diverted a river through the ruins to ensure nothing could be rebuilt. The Assyrians built the world's first true administrative terror state, and they were very, very good at it. Carthage. Carthage sat on the northern coast of Africa, in what is now Tunisia, and from roughly 814 BCE until Rome finally obliterated it in 146 BCE. It was one of the most powerful commercial and naval civilizations in the Mediterranean world. Sophisticated, wealthy, cosmopolitan, and, if the archaeological evidence is to be believed, engaged in the routine ritual burning of its own children. The top pit at Salammbô, a sacred burial site excavated in modern Carthage, contains thousands of clay urns holding the cremated remains of children, the vast majority of them infants and toddlers under the age of 4. For decades, scholars argued over whether these were sacrifice sites or simply infant cemeteries. Child mortality in the ancient world was high enough that a dedicated burial ground for babies wouldn't be unusual. But more recent analysis of the bones, including isotope studies and examination of burn patterns, has shifted the consensus significantly toward the sacrificial interpretation, with evidence suggesting many of these children were alive when they were burned as offerings to Baal, Hammon, and Tanit, the two principal Carthaginian deities. What makes this especially unsettling is that child sacrifice in Carthage doesn't appear to have been a desperate measure reserved for times of plague, drought, or military crisis. The evidence suggests it was routine religious practice, and that wealthier families who substituted lambs or other animals were actually considered to be cutting corners, offering the gods a lesser gift than what was truly owed. Carthage also practiced crucifixion with a twist that Rome, which later adopted the practice, never quite replicated. They used it on their own generals. A Carthaginian military commander who lost a battle didn't face a commission of inquiry or a demotion. He faced execution by crucifixion, a policy that created a military culture operating under conditions of absolute existential pressure. This didn't necessarily make them more effective. It arguably made them more reckless and more brutal in the field, since defeat meant death regardless of how you conducted yourself. The Mercenary War of 241 to 237 BCE, which erupted when Carthage couldn't pay the foreign soldiers it had used in the First Punic War, descended into documented atrocities on both sides, severe enough to shock ancient commentators, who were not generally squeamish people. The Roman historian Polybius, writing about the conflict, described it as a war of a peculiarly savage character, notable phrasing from a man who lived in Rome and watched gladiatorial games for entertainment. The Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire, which dominated central Mexico from roughly 1300 CE until Spanish contact in 1519 and conquest in 1521, built one of the most architecturally impressive, administratively sophisticated, and agriculturally innovative civilizations in the pre-Columbian Americas, and also ran what can only be described as an industrial-scale human sacrifice operation that was woven so deeply into the fabric of religious and political life that the two cannot be meaningfully separated. The theology was specific. The gods, particularly the sun god Huitzilopochtli, required nourishment in the form of human hearts and blood to continue their work of keeping the universe functioning. Without sufficient sacrifice, the sun would stop moving. The world would end. This wasn't fringe belief held by a priestly class. It was the foundational cosmological assumption that organized Aztec society, and it had real logistical consequences. The Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, the great double pyramid at the center of the Aztec capital, was the primary site for this activity, and beside it stood the Tzompantli, the skull rack, where the heads of sacrificed victims were displayed on wooden poles. Archaeological excavations by Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, continuing from 2017 onward, have confirmed the existence of a massive skull tower structure associated with the Tzompantli, containing over 130,000 skulls, a figure that substantially exceeded previous estimates and forced historians to revise upward their understanding of the scale of sacrifice at the capital alone. The most common sacrificial method was the one described in the outline: chest opened with an obsidian blade, heart extracted still beating, held toward the sun, body rolled down the temple steps. But Aztec religious practice was considerably more varied and specific than this single image suggests. The rain god Tlaloc required the tears of children, meaning the sacrificial victims for certain festivals had to be young enough to cry, and priests would ensure they did. The god Zyptotec, associated with renewal in the agricultural cycle, was honored by priests who wore the flayed skins of sacrifice victims over their own bodies for 20 days following the sacrifice. The institution of the Flower War, ritualized conflict with neighboring states, particularly Tlaxcala, fought specifically to capture rather than kill, generating a supply of prisoners for the altar, shows how deeply the sacrifice system shaped Aztec foreign policy and military strategy. Estimates of how many people were sacrificed at the dedication of the Templo Mayor in 1487 vary enormously, with Aztec sources claiming 80,400 over 4 days, a figure almost certainly inflated for propaganda purposes, while modern historians estimate the actual number in the hundreds to low thousands, which is still, by any measure, an extraordinary number of people killed in a ceremony. The Spartans. Sparta, the Greek city-state that occupied the Peloponnese Peninsula from roughly 900 BCE onward and reached the peak of its military dominance in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, has spent the last 2,000 years accumulating a reputation as the ultimate warrior culture. Tough, disciplined, admirable in a brutal sort of way. The reality, when examined without the romanticizing filter, is considerably darker than the movie version. The Agoge, Sparta's mandatory state education program for male citizens, began at age 7, when boys were taken from their families and placed into military barracks, to begin a process of systematic brutalization that lasted until age 30, at which point, if they survived and passed every test, they received full citizenship. The program was deliberately designed to inflict suffering. Boys were intentionally underfed, given inadequate clothing in winter, and forced to sleep on reeds they gathered themselves. They were encouraged to steal food to supplement their rations, but if caught, they were beaten severely, not for the theft, but for getting caught, because the lesson being taught was not moral, but tactical. Even more disturbing was the Cryptia, a state-sanctioned institution that functioned as both a rite of passage and a terror campaign simultaneously. Young Spartan men were sent out at night armed with nothing but a knife, with explicit state authorization to kill helots, the enslaved population that farmed Spartan land and outnumbered Spartan citizens by an estimated 7 to 1. The targets were specifically the helots who seemed strongest, most capable or most likely to organize resistance. This wasn't unofficial violence that the state tolerated. dominated. It was state policy, described by ancient sources including Plutarch. Sparta formally declared war on the Helot population every single year, a legal mechanism that allowed killing Helots without the religious pollution that murder would otherwise incur under Greek law. The infant selection process, where newborns were examined by state elders, and those deemed insufficiently healthy were carried to a cliff site called the Apothete and left to die, was not a private family tragedy, but a government mandate enforced on everyone. And for the Spartans who survived all of this and became warriors, failure in battle carried consequences that extended beyond death. Soldiers who showed cowardice were designated tremblers, stripped of all social standing, subject to public beatings by anyone who felt like it, disowned by their own families, and barred from civic life, a fate many reportedly found worse than dying in combat. Imperial Rome. Rome gets credited for its contributions to law, architecture, governance, and sanitation, and those contributions were real. But Rome also built the most elaborate, well-funded, logistically sophisticated entertainment infrastructure the ancient world had ever seen. And that infrastructure was purpose-built to kill people in front of large audiences on a regular schedule. The Colosseum, opened in 80 CE under Emperor Titus with inaugural games that reportedly lasted 100 days and killed 9,000 animals, was not an arena where death was an occasional dramatic possibility. It was a facility designed from the foundations up to process a high volume of executions efficiently while keeping crowds of 50,000 people entertained. The morning program, the Damnatio ad Bestias, involved condemned prisoners, often criminals or Christians in later periods, being released into the arena unarmed or minimally armed against lions, bears, leopards, bulls, and crocodiles imported at significant expense from across the empire. This was the appetizer before the gladiatorial bouts that most people associate with the games. The animals themselves required a vast supply chain: hunters, trappers, transport ships, holding facilities, and trainers, all to ensure that a steady flow of large and dangerous wildlife arrived at Rome and other cities' arenas in a condition suitable for killing people attractively. Roman law provided additional creative options for execution that didn't require an arena at all. The poena oculi, reserved specifically for the crime of parricide, killing your father, required the convicted person to be sewn inside a leather sack together with a live dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster, then thrown into a river or the sea, the combination of animals selected for their symbolic resonance in Roman religious tradition. Crucifixion, which most people associate with the single famous incident, was in Roman practice a routine, high-volume execution method for slaves and non-citizens, deliberately designed to be agonizing, slow, and maximally public, with the body left on display afterward as an extended warning. Roman military discipline added its own dimension: decimation, the practice of selecting every 10th man in a unit that had committed cowardice or mutiny by lot, and having the other 9 beat him to death, meant that soldiers who had done nothing wrong faced a 1 in 10 chance of being killed by their friends as collective punishment. Crassus applied this to 6,000 soldiers following the defeat of Spartacus in 71 BCE. Rome's particular achievement was making all of this normal, state-funded, publicly attended, multi-generational, woven into the social fabric so thoroughly that watching people and animals die violently was simply what you did on a day off. The Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire, which Genghis Khan began assembling in 1206 CE from the grasslands of what is now Mongolia, became the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the doorstep of Western Europe within 2 generations, and it got there through a system of incentivized terror so coldly rational, so consistently executed, and so staggeringly effective that even its victims sometimes had to acknowledge the internal logic. The offer was always the same: surrender peacefully, pay tribute, and the Mongols would leave your city intact, your population alive, and your trade routes functioning. Refuse or resist, and every living thing within the walls would be killed. Every person, every animal, every rat, with the buildings demolished and the irrigation systems deliberately destroyed to prevent the region from recovering. The crucial element that made this threat function as a military instrument rather than mere cruelty was that the Mongols followed through on both sides of it, without exception and without sentiment. Cities that surrendered were genuinely protected. Cities that resisted were genuinely annihilated. This consistency made the calculus for every subsequent city mathematically clear. The sack of Baghdad in February 1258 by Hulagu Khan, Genghis's grandson, stands as one of the most catastrophic single events in the history of Islamic civilization. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had been the political and intellectual center of the Muslim world for 5 centuries, ended in a matter of days. The House of Wisdom, a library and research institution that had spent generations accumulating the accumulated knowledge of the Greek, Persian, Indian, and Arab worlds, was destroyed, with accounts describing books thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the water ran dark. The last Abbasid caliph, al-Mustasim, was reportedly rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, a method the Mongols used for high-status enemies because it avoided spilling royal blood on the ground. Estimates of the total death toll across all Mongol campaigns range from 40 to 60 million people, with some historians placing the figure higher, representing a significant fraction of the entire global population at the time. In parts of Central Asia and Persia, regional populations did not recover to pre-Mongol levels for centuries. What makes the Mongols genuinely difficult to categorize alongside the other civilizations on this list is that Genghis Khan simultaneously issued the Yasa, a legal code that guaranteed religious freedom across the empire, protected traveling merchants, and established the principle of diplomatic immunity, meaning the same administrative mind that ordered the deaths of millions also built trade infrastructure that connected Asia and Europe more efficiently than anything that had existed before. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative stability across the empire after the conquests, allowed commerce, ideas, and unfortunately also the bacteria responsible for the Black Death to travel the Silk Road with new efficiency. The Mongols were not chaotic. They were the most organized nightmare the medieval world ever produced. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.